So before I introduce Abdul, I thought I might just say a couple of things about why we thought having the history of Palestinian liberation is so important and why we think it connects really quite profoundly with mental health. So I think firstly, the question for all of us, who narrates our histories, is a crucial one, whether that's for individuals, families, communities, or nations. And of course, who narrates is deeply embedded in practices of power. If we think about what it is to read our own history against the narrative of the oppressor. Settler colonial histories are, of course, histories of erasure. In Palestine, that took physical form in the destruction and obliteration of Palestinian villages during the Nakba, the exile of 750,000 of its people, and crucially, the desire for the disappearance of the rest, which I think is expressed in that chilling and psychotic image of a land without a people for a people without a land. And as we know from psychotherapy, healing might take the form of recovering obliterated memory. But of course, it also takes the form of resisting and reframing the narratives that are told about you, which may be pathologizing, negative, restricting. Now, in terms of memory, Palestinians are not in danger of forgetting their history, despite Ben-Gurion's confident prediction that the old will die and the young will forget. The young do not forget. So the experience of the Nakba, of slaughter, expulsion, forced dispossession, it lives on in the presence of the camps, in the memory of those in the diaspora, as well as in the ongoing expulsion of people from their lands. Being the victims of British colonialism and Zionist settler colonialism are central historical truths, but victimhood on its own can be a very thin story to live by. People who insist that their experience of oppression and subjugation are recognized, they're not taking up a victim identity as much as bearing witness to historic injury. But there's another history which is crucial for the here and now, and that's the story of resistance, which counteracts the oppressor's preferred narrative, which is that the oppressed will either disappear through death or exile, or lapse into passivity, fragmentation, or psychic oblivion. In this story, we have a much richer and thicker description of the body politic, its communities both within and outside Palestine, and all the diverse forms of liberation, struggle and resistance that have evolved since 1948, and indeed for many years before that. This relevance to mental well-being should, I hope, be obvious in the way that the history of struggle links generations, links the different parts of the Palestinian polity, and sustain connections, those very connections that settler colonialism is precisely designed to fragment. Now, there is absolutely nobody better equipped to tell this story than Abdul Razak Takriti. As well as being an eminent historian of the Palestinian Revolution, he has experience of political engagement and activism, I believe, from his quite early school days onwards, including as a student in Toronto and Oxford, where he organized Israel Apartheid Week in both universities. So we can say that he lives his history. He was born in Jordan of a West Bank family, educated in Canada and then in Oxford, where we were privileged to meet him. And his doctorate was on the revolution in Oman, which he turned into a book called Monsoon Revolution, which won many prizes. He was a lecturer in history at Sheffield University before taking up his current post as Professor of History and Director of the Arab American Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston, Texas. As well as his writing on Palestine, Abed, together with Professor Carmen Abulsi, created a wonderful online learning resource on the Palestinian Revolution, hosted by Oxford University. We'll post the link on the chat, and I strongly advise you and recommend you to access it. It's a wonderful resource. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Abed, to Cafe Palestine.
Well, thank you very much, Gwen. There isn't much to say after this eloquent introduction that you gave, and I think that it will be a challenge to meet your expectations. Gwen and I, of course, go a long way back, and she's someone who exemplifies for me the capacity for solidarity, empathy, and understanding. Of course, it was a challenge to when I first met her to learn that her ancestor is Lloyd George, who committed a great deal of crimes against the Palestinian people. But it was an inspiration to meet someone like her who is so determined to reverse the effects of colonialism and to confront these effects head on in an honest, decent, and resolute way. So thank you for hosting me also here. I love what you all are doing with Cafe Palestine. I've followed some of the previous cafes, and it's really great. Now, of course, given the fact that there's a distinguished audience of mental health workers assembled here and professionals, and given the fact that you've listened to many people through Cafe Palestine talking about the negative impact of colonialism on psychological well-being, there isn't much that I have to say on that. As mental health professionals, you're better qualified than a historian like myself to judge the impact of nightly humming of drones in Gaza, or the recurring of cyclical destruction of homes, schools, playgrounds by airstrikes and ground incursions. You're better equipped to judge the effect of incarceration on the 20% of the total population of the Palestinian occupied territories and the 40% of the male population that were at one point or another and their lives held in Israeli captivity. You're better able to reflect on the 70% of Palestinian families that have been affected by mass phenomena. You know more about the lifelong psychological, let alone physical scars of torture, and you may well have reflected on the less visible pressures, ranging from the rationing of sunlight to the denial of desire in prison, and the inability to see loved ones experienced by families on both sides of the barbed wires of incarceration. You certainly can better assess, at least on the professional level, the trauma produced by regular home demolitions or expulsions from homes in Jerusalem and elsewhere, or the damage caused by the violent bullying and attacks inflicted by settlers in places like Hebron, or the humiliation experienced at checkpoints, or the harrowing accumulation of deaths and injuries and deformities, or the experience of hundreds of families denied the basic dignity of being able to bury their loved ones because their bodies are held in Israeli university morgues. Now, I am certain that most of you thought about all of these themes, and especially when it comes to the occupied Palestinian territories in 1967. Some of you might have even extended the analysis further and considered the meaning of colonialism for Palestinian citizens, so-called Palestinian citizens of Israel, whose territories were occupied in 1948 and were reduced to a colonized minority within their own homeland, who are subjected daily to racist discourse and practices and a wide range of micro and macroaggressions. You can assess better what is the impact of watching lands that their families once owned being used by colonists that have recently arrived from across the world. What is the impact of them walking on streets renamed after the founders of their oppression or living under the flag of their colonizers? Now, some of you, and I suspect even a lesser number, might have considered the meaning of ethnic cleansing, expulsion, and denial of home upon the majority of the Palestinian people that were forced into refugeehood and exile across the world. I say I suspect it's a smaller number because the focus within the mental health community, at least insofar as I'm familiar, tends to be on research produced from the occupied territories. There's far less research that I'm familiar with, at least, on refugee communities, which happen to constitute the majority of the Palestinian people. And I think that there's a lot of themes to consider here. What does it mean for Palestinian children to grow up in a refugee camp or even a city neighborhood a few kilometers away from home, but not being able to go back home? What does it mean to be a Palestinian refugee in Libya, Lebanon, or Syria, or Libya, having experienced multiple waves of expulsion? How does an individual handle the intergenerational passing on of collective miseries caused by a violent process of ethnic cleansing that is seemingly endless and irreversible, at least if we want to listen to the dominant powers of the day? How does the collective bear the weight of being criminalized by the world for having the simple wish of returning home, of being told that they must accept their fate because the worthier people have come to take their place? Many of those present in this audience have asserted the ways these processes are gendered in society, how they are pink-washed outside, and so on and so forth. If you have Palestinian friends in Britain, you may well have thought of what does it mean for these people in your lives to be subjected to official and unofficial denial of experience, of witnessing the colonial state that prevents them from going back to their homeland being celebrated and feted in London and Manchester and across the country, of being demonized in the media for speaking their truth, of being denied platforms, of being smeared and sued as haters for exposing the racialized hatred that has long been inflicted on their people, of having solidarity movements standing with them delegitimized as anti-Semitic or Islamo-fascist or Islamo-leftist, and so on and so forth, of having their experiences belittled, of witnessing their food and culture appropriated for the benefit of the propaganda programs of their oppressors, of seeing their entire history mistaught, or even worse, utterly erased. So rather than elaborate on these and other aspects of the oppression experienced by the Palestinian people, Gwyn and I talked about the wish to examine the frameworks through which we can approach these phenomena. And we thought that historical grounding is essential in that regard. But the reason why it's essential is that there is a hegemonic model for viewing what is going on in Palestine. The hegemonic model is practiced by the UK and other governments, as well as most mainstream circles in this country. And it relies on an incoherent yet powerful mix: partial or total denial of the colonial reality, the promotion of both sidism or moral equivalency, the blaming of Palestinians for their own colonization, or more horrifically, erasing them from the conversation altogether and presenting their Israeli colonizers as victims of global prejudice, singled out for engaging in perfectly common, acceptable, and even democratic state behavior. There are myriad ways for probing the psychology of this discourse, of course. That's not my objective here today, but one out of many would be to engage in what is known in some psychological quarters as attribution theory. Should we construct a short list of the causes of the current Palestinian condition as perceived in dominant Western circles of power, we would undoubtedly include some of the following ideas. One, that Palestinians are inherently violent or have been persistently manipulated to be violent by their leaderships. Two, that Palestinians are hopelessly wedded to religious fanaticism, belonging to an aggressive Islamic worldview whose principal motivation is hatred of Western values and its regional manifestation, Israel. Three, that the ills experienced by the Palestinian people emanate out of the faults of their corrupt and self-serving leaderships or the dictatorial leaderships of the surrounding Arab states. Four, that the Palestinians are incapable of compromise, never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Five, that Palestinian children are raised on ideas of hatred, their sole obsession being to destroy Israel and deny its existence. 6, that Palestinian individuals lack a philosophy of self-improvement, choosing to wallow instead in the envy of successful Israelis. I am sure that all of us in this virtual room can add other perceived individual and social causes to the list. And I am sure we can all appreciate their combined impact, which is the legitimation of ongoing colonialism. Of course, the very existence of colonialism is generally denied by those holding these perceptions. Few British leaders today would be as forthcoming as Winston Churchill when he defended his policy of pursuing Zionist colonization of Palestine in the following terms. I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the Black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. I do not admit it. I do not think that the Red Indians had any right to say the American continent belongs to us and we are not going to have any of these European settlers coming in here. They had not the right, nor had they the power. Now, please excuse my bad rendition of Churchill's accent and all of that. I can't pull it off, even though I lived very close to his birthplace, Blenheim Palace, for many years. But I maybe psychologically, I never wanted to acquire a British accent, even though I spent 12 years in Britain. I felt that it would be a further erasure of identity, a further engagement in what colonialism wants, which is for you to seek to mirror your oppressor while not being quite the same. Anyways, to go back to Churchill, British leaders today are more likely to engage in a very different rhetoric, which is to erase altogether the settler colonial reality of what is taking place in Palestine. Instead of explicitly justifying colonialism like Churchill does, they defend it by recasting it as democracy besieged by fanatical undemocratic forces, or as a successful technological experiment flourishing in a sea of misery, or as a great ongoing queer party taking place in the midst of a wonderful liberal society. Needless to say, their motivations are diverse, including ideological or religious conviction, geostrategic calculation, and more often than not, political opportunism. So, such ideas and motivations are undoubtedly missing in this audience, and I would rather spend the rest of this talk on models of solidarity than venting my frustrations at the frameworks expounded by the sponsors and defenders of Israeli colonialism. Although I must admit, sometimes I feel a psychological urge to express and vent these frustrations. To be completely forthcoming, I wish to caution against a very common model, which is driven by the human rights framework. I will have more critically to say about that model later, but I would like to first draw to your attention a simple historic fact, which is that the human rights framework is developed and popularized in colonial metropoles and then exported into colonized space. One thinks here of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed in a settler colonial state by a UN dominated by Europe and North America. One thinks of Amnesty International in the 1960s, which was founded, of course, in the West, or Jimmy Carter's human rights discourse in the 1970s, or of the countless NGOs that mushroomed in the 1980s and 90s. This does not mean that human rights logic is entirely faulty, or that it's not useful, or that it wasn't utilized by anti-colonial movements. However, it should be noted that in an anti-colonial setting, human rights are embedded in a much more ambitious, broader, and comprehensive tactical and strategic agenda geared towards collective liberation rather than just basic individual protections. A close examination of the history of the Palestinian liberation movement illustrates this fact well. When Britain invaded Palestine and imposed on its population a program of European Zionist settler colonization, It did so with reference to a brief document that is familiar to all of us in this room, the Balfour Declaration, which read, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, besides promising, if only vaguely, colonization, this document was underlined by a clear distinction between national, political, civil, and religious rights. Civil and religious rights would encompass some aspects of what we understand today as human rights. Some of these could be extended to the indigenous population without much inconvenience to colonial authorities. That's for a simple reason, which is that colonialism, by necessity, is a form of political and national tyranny. Although it did often deny civil rights, such as equal access to courts or religious freedoms, freedom of worship, it did not need to do so by necessity. And it also often accommodated such rights. Political and national rights are a different story. Now, the drafters of the Balfour Declaration purposefully did not mention the Palestinian people, for that would have been an acknowledgement of the existence of a people, and would have then opened the question of their political and national rights. Instead, they were degradingly conceptualized, despite their indigeneity to the land and overwhelming demographic majority, as, quote, existing non-Jewish communities, end of quote. In contrast, Balfour referred to the Jewish people and promised them a national home. So Palestinians understood the meaning of this very well. Without the recognition of peoplehood and the political and national rights associated with that recognition, the people could be open to being demographically and militarily overwhelmed by colonists, losing land to them, and even being expelled by them. As we know, all of that happened within the short course of 3 decades. Between 1917 and 1947, we witnessed the demographic transformation of Palestine. And by 1948/49, that demographic transformation was anchored in state structures and boundaries, and was granted worldwide support from the great powers. From the very beginning, it was sponsored by all the great powers, but they enshrined it once they admitted the state of Israel into the UN. Once they all gave it recognition, they were like, here we go. The settler colonists have now sovereignty over the land by the definition of countries like the UK, the US, and many other European states, and North American and other settler colonial formations created by Europe. So when you look at this situation and you think of the Palestinian struggle from this lens, we notice that throughout the British occupation period, which, by the way, is erroneously referred to in colonized history books and epistemologies as the Mandate period. It's, that's mandate is a legitimation concept for the British rule there. But that's not what was going on. It was not a mandate granted by the League of Nations. It was an occupation forced by military presence. If you look at it from the Palestinian experience, there was nothing legitimate about it. Anyways, if you look at that whole British occupation period, the Palestinian people organized to fight this reality, and through calling for political rights, democratic representation, and national independence. Now, equally, the Jewish agency led by Chaim Weizmann and the British colonial authorities fought tooth and nail to ensure that this would never happen. They did so with reference to a variety of political and legal conceits. But ultimately, they won through sheer force, as was seen during the suppression of the Great Palestinian Revolt of 1936 to 39, and as was seen later on in the Nakba of 1948. It's very important to understand this factor because I'm sure as mental health professionals, you're probably intrigued by what does that mean for the people on the ground. Well, let's simulate a few situations. Every Palestinian village had to deal with the presence of colonies nearby. And throughout the British period, there was a constant policy of disarming Palestinian villages, which in many ways, I'm sure you can understand both the material and psychological significance of that. When you're being disarmed in a violent environment, you're told you can, that you have no protection, basically. And at the same time, the colonies nearby were being armed on a very heavy basis. You know, sometimes it was done openly, sometimes it was done in heavy ways. And you'd have these colonists walk around with their guns. Some of them would even do something worse. You had these groupings that were established to secure kibbutzes and moshavim that would wear Arabic clothes, dressed like Bedouins, and to add insult to injury, you know, they would and they would be carrying these weapons, and they would be shooting at people, and they would be assaulting people in the same way that you see today the settlers carrying around their Uzis in Palestinian neighborhoods. One settler in Hebron can close a street for thousands of people because they need to pass by. Okay? That was the reality that people had to deal with. That was the reality they had to deal with in 1948 when they suffered a major shortage of tools with which to defend themselves. Because contrary to the popular perception of 1948 that tends to focus overwhelmingly on either Arab states or the colonists, who sometimes, by the way, historians of that period preemptively call them, already they call them Israelis, even before Israel is found at that stage. They forget that these are irregular militias, illegal militias roaming around, terrorizing the countryside, ethnically cleansing people, okay? So you have this, this focus on these groups. What we forget is that in every Palestinian village, in every Palestinian town, there was a local defense committee set up by the people. And it was done organically. And it was done from the bottom up. And it was facing a very difficult environment, precisely because of the lack of tools with which to defend oneself and resources with which to do so. So that had an impact on perceptions in Palestinian circles after the Nakba. It had a major result on how Palestinians viewed their reality after the Nakba. When you look at Palestinian writings, both during 1948, 1949, but also in the early 50s, there's a lot of talk and a lot of anger at why the Arab governments did not arm the people. And of course, for a historian like myself, or some of the historians in this audience as well, I know that we have Avi Shleim with us, we know very well that these governments were weak. They had just emerged out of their own colonial experiences, and actually, most of them were still shackled by indirect forms of colonialism. The Jordanian army had a British officer leading it. It was dependent on a British subsidy, and it was led by a ruler who was promised a chunk of Palestine by Britain, even though no British official would ever admit that. But when they were talking, and notice this, about partitioning Palestine even, they spoke of an Arab state. They didn't talk of a state for the Palestinian Arab people. These are important facts to know, because the idea was to assign governance to allies of the British colonial project. So a place like Jordan would have had not only no capacity, but no intention to arm the people. A place like Syria was dealing with a military in shambles. The military established by the French authorities in Syria was established along sectarian and ethno-nationalist lines for the purpose of counterinsurgency in Syria. It was not established to defend Syria. So such a military was bound to not only fail in the war, but not to have the resources or capacities to support the Palestinian people. And same goes for the Egyptian military and so on and so forth. Now, you can argue they could have done more, you could argue they could have sent more weapons, and that's precisely what Palestinians were arguing. But when we look at the structural situation, it's a colonial one as well. Nevertheless, Palestinians come out of this disaster in which they're expelled from their homes. Gwyn threw a number, 750,000, but that should be understood in percentage terms, not just in number terms, because I know some terrible historians out there. There's one here in Houston at Rice University that teaches students that, look, in the greater scheme of things, 750,000 is a small number. But when you look in percentage terms, in a country with 1.5 million, 750,000 is a lot of people. Less than 1.5 million. It's like, this is a huge chunk of the people. And it doesn't even refer to the people that were internally displaced within 1948. It doesn't refer to all the people that ended up later on undertaking other journeys of exile and displacement as a result of future wars and long-term pressures. The majority of the Palestinian people today live in exile. I don't like the word diaspora, by the way, because that's a borrowing from Jewish history that does not have anything to do with this experience. Diaspora has a sense of permanence to it. Until we get, until actually Zionism started adopting Protestant theologies of exile, in relation to exile. Diaspora connoted a being in its own right, a permanent state in its own right. Shatat in Palestine, which is the word we use in Arabic, means dispersal. Okay? And it's not a positive thing, and it's not supposed to be a permanent thing. It refers to the whole being divided, a scattering of the people that has to be overcome because it has a very recent point of origin that is materially traceable, historically grounded in immediate personal experience. This is not just some reflection on history in a detached way or in an abstract way. This is a very real, something just happened kind of experience. So the people were dealing with this exile. They had to figure out what to do. The older generation at this stage, aside from a few figures, exited the arena or stayed engaged in it in limited ways. And you can appreciate why. I mean, you go and read these biographies and memoirs and testimonies from that period, and you see symptoms of withdrawal, symptoms of depression, of complete demoralization, of an absence of hope. We have a word that commonly gets uttered in these contexts, and I've heard it like a million times when I've done oral history work on this period. Hasra. It's a Palestinian word. It's like a certain bitterness almost that comes, but it's more than that. It's a feeling of great loss. It's a mourning of a sort. I wanted to play actually a clip by someone who had a mild experience relative to other people of the Nakba, but he talks about it in powerful ways. I sent the text to Gwen, but I don't think she saw it. Am I able to play it in the? Hi, Gwen. Yeah, we can't hear you.
I think if we can make you a co-host,
okay.
I'll see whether I can, but I think
I've
Graham
will. I've done that. I've made Abdullah co-host.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, excellent. You're ready to go.
Ready to go. Okay, so let me, let's see. So if I would have to share a screen, correct?
Yeah.
So this is Mahmoud al-Khalidi, who later became one of the founders of and one of the first central committee members of the largest Palestinian party at the time, which was Fatah. Yeah. Now, of course, nowadays when we think Fatah, we think Mahmoud Abbas and all of that, but of course it has a long and distinguished history of struggle as well before these current leaderships. So let's let me put him here.
We can't see your screen at the moment.
You can see it?
No.
You can't see it?
No.
Okay. Sorry about that. Let's see. Share screen. Okay, can you see it now?
No, I'm afraid we can't. I think there might be something you have to click on the share screen. When you press the share screen icon, I think there's something you have to click to get the video, but I can't see it because I'm not allowed to.
Well, I tried to.
Mine is disabled.
I've made you a co-host as well, Gwyn. But if you want to send me the link, Abdul, then I'll try and share my screen.
Yeah, I think that would be better. Yeah.
Send it to me.
Sorry about that, everyone.
Chat.
I think you have to put share sound and optimize for video clip.
Okay, so here, I'll share it on the chat. I sent it to you, Gwen, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's on the chat. That's good. Yep. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll send it.
Here, let me send it to Martin as well. Yeah. Sorry, everyone. So yeah, so we're gonna listen a little bit to Mahmoud al-Khalidi, who he notes himself had a milder version of what happened in the Nakba, but he'll explain to you. It's better to hear it in his own words.
So I don't have the link, but I think Martin and Gwyn have it. So maybe one of you two could share your screen, please, or send it to me.
I've sent it to you. I sent it to everyone, so you should get it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you're there, I think.
Good. Let's see if you can hear it. Hold on. Where is it?
I think it would be good if you make it full screen, because if you expand it, because it will be subtitled.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
يعني لم نعاني ربما كثيرا كما عانى الجميع، لأنه والدي كان متزوج من بعد وفاة والدتي من سيد لبناني من صيدا، وبالتالي جئنا إلى صيدا وسكننا في بيت، عندها بيت كان من طابقين، فسكننا الحقيقة في بيتها. هذه المرحلة أو هذه الفترة هنا بداية فترة الخمسينات إن صح التعبير. كان والدي ياخذني معه في صيدا إلى مقهى. كان هذا المقهى أظن كان اسمه يمكن قهوة الإزاز أو شيء، لأن واجهاته كلها زجاجية. كان يلتقي فيه أهالي حيفا، في بعضهم البعض، طمأنوا على بعضهم البعض، وكثير من الفلسطينيين كانوا يلتقوا فيه. كان ملتقى الحقيقة للفلسطينيين، وكنت أنا برفقة والدي أستمع إلى أحاديثهم. لفت نظري الحقيقة، الآن بستعرض هذا الشريط أو هذه المحطة من الشريط الذاكرة. كان الحديث كله يدور على أن العودة محتمة في 15 أيار، الذي هو موعد دخول الجيوش العربية. وكثيرين ما كانوا يعني يرهقوا أنفسهم، اللي معه مصاري مثلا وهذول كله، إنه يروح يستأجر بيت يفرشوا كذا، لأنه ما في ضرورة، يعني هو راجع. كانت العودة بالنسبة إليهم يعني تصل إلى مرحلة اليقين. وأنا القصة قصة أسابيع، ولا يستطيع العقل الفلسطيني كان أن يصدق أن هذه الغربة هي غربة طويلة ودائمة. ثم بدأت أسمع أحاديث أخرى بعد 15 أيار، إنه مدة أسابيع، شهر، شهرين، وأكثرهم تشاؤما يقول 3 أشهر، وتقوم الدنيا عليه بقلب المقهى الله أكبر كيف 3 أشهر. إذا هذه مرحلة في فترة الخمسينات. إذا جاز لنا أن نقسم فترة الخمسينات إلى مراحل، مرحلة كانت فيها العودة واصلة إلى مرحلة اليقين وأن القصة لن تطول. واستطيع ان ارى في مرحله في الخمسينات، فتره الخمسينات، اكثر من مرحله. المرحله الاولى هي هذه المرحله. المرحله الثانيه التي رايتها، وخاصه عندما انتقلت الى دمشق. انا انتقلت الى دمشق في مطلع الخمسينات او نهايه 49 بدايه 50 لاستكمل دراستي هون، لانه اخي الكبير كان موفق في وظيفة محترمة في مركز البريد والبرق والهاتف شو، فكان هنا بشتغل. فأنا انتقلت من صيدا، جيت على طول إلى دمشق لألتحق بدراستي واستكمل دراستي. لاحظت طبعا، التحقت هنا في الإعدادي، وفي لقاءاتي مع أصدقائي في المدرسة، وكان عندنا تجمع فلسطيني كبير في المدرسة، مدرسة الثانوية الأهلية في سروجة. لاحظت أنه عدد من الفلسطينيين انتسب إلى الأحزاب العربية.
I think we can stop here.
Okay.
So it's unfortunate that the internet quality was not that great, but I hope that people saw the subtitles at least. I was able to hear what he was saying and see the subtitles. So yeah, so this is Mahmoud al-Khalidi, and what he's describing is something that everyone you interview in this period describes. The initial expulsion is encountered with disbelief, denial, a general weddedness to the idea that there will be salvation coming right now. And then people had to adjust to a different situation at a very deep level, which is what to do once you realize that this is a very powerful colonial project that will not allow you to go back home, that the states, neighboring states that you put your faith in are too weak to confront it, that the entirety of the global system criminalizes you and them for trying to confront it. Okay, so you're not just standing against that settler colonial project, you're standing against Britain, you're standing against the United States, you're standing against France, even the Soviet Union at that stage, by the way, which gave the settler colonists the weapons with which they expelled the people through the Czech arms deal. Okay, so once people had to grapple with that, they needed to figure out a way to adjust to this reality, and they began to organize. But it was the young people like Mahmoud al-Khalidi that we just saw that were beginning to organize. And it was not, by the way, just men like him or upper middle class people like him. This was a phenomena that primarily took place in the refugee camps, along with, of course, all other settings in the Palestinian communities. It also included a very large number of women. Had we had more time, I would have been happy to examine the process in its depth through multiple interviews. It would have been lovely. But when you look at what people describe, you have this experience of a new generation coming in that, by the way, was highly educated. Because there was a premium placed on education in Palestinian settings. A very large number, actually, of people managed to also benefit from the rise of things like teachers' colleges in this period, particularly women. They benefited from teachers' colleges, from the opening of universities across the region, from the greater availability of primary and secondary education. This was the early independence period in the Arab world. You had governments that invested heavily in that, like Nasser's government in Egypt and later Qasim's in Iraq and so on. So Palestinians were, a good chunk of them were part of this process. Of course, another chunk were completely lumpen proletarianized and not just proletarianized, and had to live in conditions that were very difficult. But, and a good example is Lebanon, where the laws were so shackling and they were driven by sectarian hatred in the case of Lebanon. But when we look at the overall situation, what we notice, of course, is this general sense of ferment. And that goes across the board. Okay. Often, by the way, why I always say across the board, across class lines, across social lines and gender lines, is that the image of the Palestinian refugee tends to be in the Western psyche, in this period at least, one of destitution, one of a child crying for help. And there's good research now coming out. A friend and colleague of mine, Daniel Cohen, is working on this actually. He contrasts the image of Jewish refugees coming out of Europe in this period and how it's presented in the Western publications in this period. They're presented as militant, as demanding their rights, as wanting to go to Zion, as very well organized, proud people. Of course, you have other images going on, but there's a lot of images that emphasize the political aspect of that. And you see it in even Hollywood films, Exodus and so on and so forth. There are the heart wrenching stories and very sad portrayals, but there's also a resoluteness and a determination and a politicization of the whole phenomenon. It's a political people that has political aims and therefore deserves a political outcome. For the Palestinians, you end up with, let's set up a UN agency to take care of them. And that was very offensive to people like Mahmoud Khalidi and others that you see from that period. When you look at all Palestinian parties in that period and organizations, because as you would have heard from the last bit of Mahmoud's interview, people were starting to join political parties, and in many cases starting to create them. They were all complaining about this image of the Palestinian refugee that is a humanitarian case. Refugeehood had nothing to do with destitution per se. Destitution was the economic impact of refugeehood, but the Palestinians were capable in many cases of overcoming that. You would have a refugee family, 9 or 8 brothers and sisters would be working. They would save some money, send the eldest one to university, and then he would spend money on the second one, and then the third one would educate the fourth one. That's, by the way, there are many stories like that. Anybody who has known Palestinian families will see hundreds and thousands of stories like that. Okay, so there were, you can have social mobility in situations of exile. That could be limited in places like Lebanon, again, when you have laws and legal structures, but it's not impossible. Some refugee camps can turn into neighborhoods, as happened in Yarmouk camp before it was destroyed recently in Syria. So the issue is political. The issue is that these are people prevented from going back home. And if we only think of it as a humanitarian case, as the Palestinian revolutionaries understood very well at that time, that does not only degrade the people, they're not asking for your help. They don't need charity. Okay? What they need is solidarity. And that was the point that was emphasized over and over and over again. And for Palestinian revolutionaries at the time, there was little hope in solidarity coming from the West. In fact, you read these pamphlets that say the myth of international conscience. There is no such thing as international conscience. We need self-reliance. And we need connections with other struggling peoples. That's why Palestinian revolutionaries were very attracted to a big model at the time, which was the Algerian model. They believed that what was taking place in Algeria should be copied in Palestine. In Algeria, you had a similar situation of settler colonization. You had the Pieds Noirs ruling over the Algerian people. Of course, the difference there is that the Pieds Noirs wanted to exploit the Algerian people rather than completely expel them. Okay, so they took all the land, but they kept the people working for them. You still had 9 million Algerians and 1 million Pieds Noirs, similar to the South African demographic situation. In Palestine, the colonists wanted to expel the people. And aside from that structural difference, what mattered for the revolutionaries in Palestine is what the Algerian people were doing, not necessarily what is the exact structural reality of colonialism they're facing. And what the Algerian people were doing is that they organized themselves and they established a national front, the FLN. And through that, they led an armed struggle And the armed struggle was supported by the surrounding Arab states, but it was not controlled by them. So Nasser in particular spent a lot of energy on that. Later on, when Tunisia and Morocco gained independence, there were bases established in those countries. And the model was that Algerians would liberate themselves with the support of the surrounding Arab states. That was the idea. That became the ideological basis for Fatah, which became later on the largest Palestinian party. They were arguing that any Palestinian vision that is based on dependence on Arab governments is misguided. The idea that Arab armies will bring back Palestine is illusory. The idea that such states have an interest in doing so is illusory. You needed the Palestinian people to carry out the battle, and then the Arab people will be mobilized in their support. And by the way, it was difficult to distinguish between the Palestinian and Arab experience at the time because there was so much solidarity in the Arab world at the time with the Palestinian people. And of course, there's so much cultural affinity and connectedness. And within the Palestinian scene, even there had long been pan-Arabist inclinations from the very beginning. So it's not like people were saying, you know, we're not Arabs here. But for Fatah, they wanted to emphasize the Palestinian aspect of the identity because they felt that without doing that, along Algerian lines, the people are lost and erased. And you cannot then claim for them political rights. You cannot regain Palestine. That was the Fatah dimension. You had another current that out of which the Popular Front of Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine came. That was the movement of Arab nationalists. And that was founded by people like George Habash and Wadi Haddad, who were students in the American University of Beirut. They studied under a very well-known intellectual, Konstantin Zurek, who, by the way, wrote a famous tract called The Meaning of the Nakba. It's an interesting tract because it offers an explanation of the Nakba that is a broader Arab explanation. It's saying that the Nakba is the sign of the absence of modernity, both economic and political and military in the Arab setting. And it required a cultural and political and economic revolution across these countries. That was required to be able to confront this very aggressive settler colonial project, because you're not going to be able to confront it with states that did not have considerable GDPs, that did not have the capacity to mobilize large armies, because they are confronting a very mobilized army. They are confronting the armies of the whole Western world, in a sense. It's a very difficult challenge to confront. How are they going to do it without development? How are they going to do it without unity? This is why you see such a great deal of emphasis on Arab unity in the 1950s and 1960s in Palestinian circles. They were like, we lost Palestine because of division in the region. We need to overcome that division in order to be able to deal with that. Somebody's calling me too soft on Arab states in the chat. Yeah, they were all created as dictatorships, the dictators. Yeah, sure. I don't disagree with you, Tom, when you say they were all dictatorships and were created as such by the colonial powers. But that's not being it's not, this has nothing to do with being soft on them or not. The discussion that I was presenting. I was just pointing out that even if they had the capacity, they were constrained by the colonial reality, and that their nature as states was an outcome of the colonial reality. And now, by the way, Syria was not dictatorial at this stage, although it had a democratic experiment during the period you're talking about. You had the first military coup as a result of the Nakba. And by the way, that was sponsored, that was supported by figures that were connected to Americans, and were making all sorts of overtures to them. Okay, we don't need to go into that. We can go into this period in detail if you want. But it's a very complex reality. What you see, however, the common theme is that it's a colonial reality. Not a single one of these states was capable of dealing with the situation. Doesn't mean that they couldn't have done more. Doesn't mean that they could have armed, for example, Palestinian resistance on the ground. And that's precisely what Palestinians were saying at the time. So you had the movement of Arab nationalists providing a second current to the Fatah one, a second model, based on this idea of Arab unity, based on the idea of revolutionizing the Arab states. They would have shared Tom's assessment that these states are corrupt, that nobody should be soft on them, and we need to just overthrow them. Okay, and we need to create an immediate project of unity between them. The movement of Arab nationalists later adopted Marxism in the 1960s. It shifted as a result of a complex process, but after the '67 war especially, it developed a new analysis saying, okay, the idea that classical Arab armies are going to liberate Palestine was inaccurate, because the Arab states are led by petty bourgeois leaderships, even the ones that claim to be revolutionary. So that was their analysis of, for example, Nasser's Egypt. And they were like, okay, now we need long-term people's war along the Vietnamese model. The Vietnamese model, for those of you who are familiar with it, and I'm sure many are, was that there is a liberated part of the country, which is North Vietnam, that's used as the base out of which the occupied part of the country, South Vietnam, will be liberated. This is why people in the Popular Front of Liberation of Palestine would often say that Amman should be the Hanoi of the Arabs, for example. The model is based on an idea that the states surrounding Palestine should be fully mobilized, that it is the people who will be fighting the struggle ultimately through guerrilla warfare along Vietnamese lines, because classical armies cannot confront colonial, far larger colonial forces. And that this will bring about the transformation of the whole situation, because if the battle is long-term, you will exhaust the colonial power, and you can then eventually build a more democratic society.
Abid, I'm just going to because we've got 15 minutes, and I'm just wondering whether
answer absolutely. Yeah.
You might like to take some questions, or you might want to end with some reflections now, and then we'll ask some questions. Sure. Because it's been so rich, and there's so much for us all to think about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think when you look at these models, then you have the Fatah model, you have the PFLP model, and then you have a third model, which is, of course, the communists that believe that the Eastern Bloc will be able to change the equation through internationalist struggle, will be able to transform what is going on. A fourth model that later becomes important, but in this period was not that strong, was the Islamic one, the pan-Islamic one. The Muslim Brotherhood achieved some presence in Palestine after 1948, but it was not focused on political struggle. In fact, many of the cadres that founded Fatah had originally come from the Muslim Brotherhood, but were feeling completely disillusioned by lack of action. That changed in the 1980s. Muslim Brotherhood became very politicized, and it introduced a different language than the internationalist anti-colonial language of the aforementioned groupings and parties I talked about. And we can talk about them later, but there were two formations that came out of that phenomena, which are Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So we'll talk about all of that later on, but and maybe we'll talk a little bit about the human rights framework for viewing all of this and how this challenges the human rights framework, because none of the Palestinian parties that I mentioned now, none of the movements in which hundreds of thousands of people were involved would have framed what was going on as just a struggle for basic individual protections. They were looking at something much bigger. They wanted the sovereignty of the people, its capacity to achieve the political rights and the national rights that it had long been denied. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Abid, and it's been an absolute tour de force, and we feel we need to have you back for another, at least one other update on the story. I'm sure lots of other people will have questions, but I just wanted to ask you how you think about the history of armed struggle, because anti-colonial movements obviously involve armed struggle, and how you think about the place of armed or violent struggle now, and whether you think there has been a shift to non-violent means of struggle in the form of BDS, or how you think about that that movement and change.
Well, let me start by emphasizing that the question of armed struggle or lack thereof in colonized contexts and by colonized peoples, that question is discussed as a question of strategy, okay? Strategy and tactics. In the Western context, it's often reduced to a question of morality. And they come and misappropriate great anti-colonial figures like Gandhi, who understood, by the way, armed struggle and peaceful resistance and so on in strategic and tactical forms. And if you go back and read all of Gandhi's comments on India, but also on Palestine, he talks about these questions in strategic and tactical forms, not just in moral forms. Of course, there is a moral question to be asked of, is killing people ever right? But in situations like that of Palestine or Algeria or South Africa or Rhodesia or Angola, the colonial structure in its own, by default, is violent. It was very difficult to have a conversation in the West about any of those struggles when they were unfolding. It is also very difficult to have a conversation about Palestine. You know, there's an interesting, if you Google it, you will find it. There's an interesting panel back in the days when Algeria was going on between Noam Chomsky and Conor Cruz O'Brien and whatever. Even Noam Chomsky there is denouncing the FLN, okay? Not without like delegitimizing the revolution. You know, he's committed to the ideas of the revolution, but then he feels he has to go and denounce. That's a problematic position to take. You don't know what it means to be an Algerian, even if you're Noam Chomsky. You know how to be a university professor at MIT if you're Noam Chomsky, and to be a great figure of solidarity and support for people. but you have no idea about what it means to be subjected to the kind of accumulation of insults, macro and micro aggressions on a constant hourly basis, you know, as happens in Palestine and Algeria and elsewhere. Okay, so I think, and also you don't know anything obviously about how the Vietnamese people gained their freedom if you come and say you're not allowed to use arms. Pacifism would not have confronted the American imperial power in Vietnam. You can convince me otherwise, but it would be hard, okay, because it would go against the historical record. There are situations where armed struggle is not the best strategy or tactic. And that's a debate for the Palestinian people to have. Okay, I have ideas about that. For example, I don't think that this particular moment is the best one, but that's related to issues of capacity. That's related to issues of reality around us. You know, we shouldn't also go into the other extreme and elevate armed struggle as some great moral virtue. It's a strategy, just like any other strategy. If it serves the principles of the people, then it can be applied and has been applied across the world.
But I have a question from Heba about the South African model. Would you like to ask your question, Heba?
Mm-hmm.
Have we lost Heba? Well, basically her question was, do you think the South African model has any chance for Palestine? Are there ways of thinking about the Palestinian struggle in terms of, oh, here she is. Have I asked your question to your satisfaction, Heba? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So
Yeah,
that was the question.
I mean, the South African model, people often reduce it to the question of BDS in South Africa, but it's not. Like if you follow, for example, you know, Oliver Tambo has great speeches about this. That what are the four different aspects? They had four different aspects to the anti-apartheid struggle. One aspect was actually developing the capacity at resistance, and that was often emphasized by the ANC. That's why they had the MK, and that's why they had all these structures associated by them. At the same time, there had to be a structure for solidarity, okay? And international solidarity, by the way, was the last point if you look at ANC program, because there's other things going on. You had to have your own capacity developed. You had to unify yourself as a people. I think as Palestinian people today, our main challenge is to actually reclaim our own popular structures. Because all the movements that I spoke about eventually managed to coordinate with each other through the creation of a national structure, which was the PLO at the time. Now, for the past 30 years plus, the PLO has been marginalized, has been overtaken by a parallel institution, the PA, whose job is to run essentially services and municipal control while outsourcing the security responsibilities of the Israelis and oppressing the Palestinian people on their behalf. So it's a problem, okay? That is not the job of the PLO. The PLO is called the Palestine Liberation Organization, not the Palestinian Authority. And look at the difference between liberation, authority. They're two different terms, two different concepts. Authority is about control. Liberation is about empowerment, okay? So how do we reclaim that? That is the big challenge for us, because if we reclaim that, then we can have discussions, meaningful discussions about what are the appropriate strategies. And more importantly than discussions, we can then actually have the capacity to implement that. This is why a lot of Palestinians today are calling for the revival of national institutions along democratic lines, and not just through the control of the leaders that came out of the Oslo process and that are running the show today.
Thank you. Martin, did you have a question? Martin or Teresa? I can't pick up, there are a few comments in the chat, but I don't think there's actually there's a comment from Pamela about the destruction of apartheid being a victory, but the position of black people not having changed all that much. But I don't think it was a question exactly. Did you want to add a question, Martin?
I hope I'm not going too far off topic. I mean, one thing I was thinking, listening to you, was about the importance of historical knowledge, and I'm just really pleased that you have been here today, and I feel we've got a really sort of rich picture up until sometime in the 1960s, and as Gwyn said, I wondered if it might be possible at some point to continue with as detailed a sort of continuation to the present day, which feels like it's been sort of, obviously, there wasn't time and there's a few sentences. But my sort of questions was sort of curiosity, really, on slightly tangent issues. And one of them was about one of the things that's come up in the cafes over time has been the relentless assault on culture, on history, on national identity, and so forth, in so many ways. And I wondered about whether it. I also remember a study, I believe, which compared the impact of social crisis on peoples in Palestine, but I think people in the Balkans, and that the importance of a coherent and proud narrative explaining the situation, explaining something of the differential impact that those crises made on people's well-being and health and so on. But I've also, I've got here something that Rosemary Sayegh, I hope she doesn't mind me quoting an email from her, but she was talking about her concern at the absence of books about Palestine in Arabic. And she was speaking from Lebanon, I believe. And she was saying that of all local publishers, there is no book about Palestine, and the UNRWA's education system doesn't include any mention or any element on Palestinian history and geography. And I was just wondering if there is how robust, if you like, the national narrative is amongst the dispersed Palestinian people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you should say that. I'm going to send you actually maybe a link that perhaps Gwyn or you could share with everybody else, which was debates on Palestinian pedagogy that were taking place in the 1970s. Were very much centered on this issue. Like, how do you build actually a Palestinian individual that is capable of dealing with the reality of liberation? Because the problem that was posed by the author, who's a very well-known pedagogical theorist in Palestine, Sam Zakhnini, at the time, he was asking, look, the education system is set up to train people to be doctors and engineers and so on and so forth, because education systems correspond to social realities and social needs, okay? And often they're dominated by economic logics. However, in the case of Palestine, you also need the social needs and social necessities are also for people who can engage in liberation. And those are very specific tasks, the task of engaging in liberation. You need a different set of values and concepts of learning power there. Resilience might be much more important for you than for example, technical knowledge. The ability to withstand enormous psychological pressure and trauma might be much more important for you as a Palestinian child, and being given tools for processing your reality, through the education system is important. Learning about your history and geography might be more significant for you than learning some about certain math equations potentially, because your immediate reality is at stake here. Your very being as a people is at stake here. I'll share that document with you. Now, you know, Rosemary, of course, has done wonderful work herself, but I would disagree with her that there's no Arabic books. There's a huge Arabic literature. I read it all the time. Now, in the curriculum, we have a problem because there's been a constant erasure of Palestine in the surrounding Arab curriculum. And multiple states have removed. There used to be a book in many states which was called the Qadiyya Palestiniya, the Palestinian cause. Okay, in Jordan, for example, that was part of the curriculum. They removed it after the peace treaty with Israel. In Palestine itself, they colonized the curriculum. So you hear about things like, oh, Palestine's shore is Gaza on the Mediterranean. Okay, what happened to my city, Haifa? Okay, are we going to buy the Israeli claim that to talk of Haifa is just an aggressive attempt to destroy Israel? Or are we going to say that the people that come from Haifa have a right to Haifa as much as Russian Jews or Polish Jews or Jews from the UK for that matter? Like, by the way, one of the worst historians in the world, Benny Morris, who keeps distorting what's going on the ground. He's from Britain, okay? And he comes and tells me, oh, you can't be in Haifa. Yeah, regular phenomena that man, I can't even begin to tell you the aggressions we're confronted with on a regular basis, but it's insane. Like, so that's I think on the curricular level, we have a problem. History books, no, we have a lot of them.
I'm going to take a couple more questions. I just would normally finish at 5:30, but I think it would be lovely if we could just carry on. So those people are able to stay. Maybe you can stay for another 5 or 8 minutes and we'll finish at 20 to 6. There's a question for you from Ian.
Mm-hmm.
How likely is unity between Fatah and Hamas?
Mm-hmm.
You have to answer this in 1 minute, Abid.
Yeah, very quickly, I think the focus here is not the right one. It's often like that in Palestinian circles. People ask how likely the unity between Fatah and Hamas. They talk about ending the inqisam, the separation between the two. But in reality, I don't expect unity between political parties that have very different ideologies. And it shouldn't be required, okay? What should be required, however, is a unity of the Palestinian people. So let me illustrate this with an example. In South Africa, there was not a total unity between the Communist Party, for example, and the more nationalist wing of the movement. Each one retained its ideologies and differences, but they had a working formula for operating together and for joint struggle. Of course, even there were other organizations that were not part of that working formula, and you know very well about those histories, and sometimes they had very legitimate cadres, you know, and histories and so on. But it's the important thing is they were able to have enough of a coherent structure to be able to carry through the process of liberation. In Palestine, we've always had a pluralist model. In the height of the revolutionary period, we had a great deal of pluralism. And I don't think that was bad, to be honest with you. I don't think it was, people sometimes say that was a cause of failure and so on. I think that's a teleological kind of conception. I think actually there's a lot to be said for the lack of bloodiness in the Palestinian experience of dealing with political diversity and plurality. In other settings, some of which are settings I respect, like Vietnam and elsewhere, the Communist Party, for example, was like, okay, we're the leaders here. The FLN did the same thing. We're the leaders here. If you're not, you know, if you don't follow the FLN line, you could be killed sometimes. Some of Masalli Hajj's followers, for example, were purged, okay? We didn't have that in the Palestinian experience historically, and we shouldn't have it now. Unity has to come through unified structures, which is why there needs to be a reclamation and the democratization of the PLO.
And thank you. And a question from Heather, which is, what about the ICC?
ICC is again, like, I think it's a great arena that is that our so-called leadership at the moment has not been able to pursue fully, and that's another tragic consequence of the absence of something like a liberation organization for the Palestinian people at the moment. You know, because of course we should the energies of the Palestinian people put fully, and the people in solidarity with them, into a program of dealing with the Israeli abuses on an international level, I think we would be able to achieve some substantial gains. We were able to do that up till the early 1990s. You know, it should not be forgotten that once upon a time, the majority of humankind, including almost all Asian and African states, considered Zionism to be a form of racism. That was adopted by the UN. Now, it was widely rejected by the British and the Europeans, but these were the people that were the enemies of the Palestinian people from the beginning and that set up Zionism in the first place. Okay, so the colonial structures will never like what we were doing, but we were achieving a great deal of success. We helped a lot of other people also in these fora. By the way, Palestinians played a big role in supporting their South African sister revolution and other revolutionary struggles in that period through these forums. But international law has its limits. Before the anti-colonial movement started to pursue campaigns to use international law and to develop it in a way that was helpful for national liberation, international law was initially an instrument of colonialism. That's how Palestine was colonized. Remember, what do the Israelis, how do they justify themselves when they say the Palestinians are out there to destroy Israel and deny our existence? The first thing they come and tell you, the Palestinians rejected a UN resolution. Okay? They don't tell you that the UN resolution was unjust. They don't tell you that the UN resolution was written by a bunch of colonialist countries that hate Palestinians and spoke of them in racist ways. They don't tell you about, you know, laws reflect the social structures behind them. Remember, Jim Crow was a law of the land in the United States. It reflected the social structure there. Does that mean it was correct to apply it? Does it mean that it was wrong to break it? Were the people that said, I don't want to not mix with my African-American sisters and brothers, were they criminals? By legal definition, they were criminals. Okay, so at the same time, however, there were people, the civil rights lawyers and attorneys, that were able to achieve a great deal of good through the laws. So if we think of it in this term, if we look at what's underlying it, then I think it's very helpful, and we can do a lot of work at the ICC and elsewhere.
Thank you, Abid. I think we're going to wind up now. There was one question, but it's a very big one about the attacks on Palestinian academics in America and how Houston has been treating you. And you may wish to say a couple of things about that, or we may just wind up. That was a question from Tom. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Palestinian academics like myself have been subjected to many attacks and have sometimes lost jobs, sometimes very significant jobs, sometimes, you know, unfortunately, it's not just about being Palestinian academic, though, I should note. It is about being an academic who is anti-colonial and systematically pursues anti-colonial discourse on Palestine. You can be a Palestinian academic that tells people things they want to hear in the United States and they'll love you. And that is a model that is very common as well, okay? But that, of course, means that you have to erase yourself and you have to erase your people from your consciousness. Or you have to create certain adjustment mechanisms in your mind, which is where, for example, let's say, you know, if I were to frame the Palestinian struggle as just human rights, they would be very happy in the United States. If I were to frame Palestinian struggle as this is about reversing settler colonialism and achieving a unified vision of liberation for both the colonists and the settlers, but without ignoring the positionality of each, and the fact that the settlers dominate the native population. Okay, when you talk in those terms, they don't like to hear that in the United States. Of course, it reminds them of their own reality as a country built on colonialism and the destructions of peoples, as well as the other pillar, which is slavery. So, you know, there are reasons also why it's so difficult to engage in these logics.
Thank you so much, Abid. I just want to say, I think we've had an absolute tour de force. I think that you've opened up so many levels of historical experience that we really all need to know about. And we hope there'll be an opportunity to have you back for another survey.